Then let him watch. From behind the line. The words tore through the shooting range like a shot. Every recruit froze mid-motion, rifles half raised, ears ringing from more than the echo of gunfire. The instructor's voice carried authority sharpened by contempt. He stood tall in front of the firing stations, jaw clenched, clipboard tucked tight under his arm, and his finger jabbing toward the older man standing near the observation fence. The old man didn't move. He simply stood there, hands folded behind his back, posture straight despite the years tugging at his shoulders. His jacket, olive and frayed at the collar, rippled lightly in the wind. He wasn't smiling, wasn't glaring, wasn't even reacting, just watching, silent. The instructor turned in a sharp half-step, addressing the gathered recruits without looking at them. "This isn't a sightseeing tour, ladies. He's not part of this drill, he's not cleared for this range, and he's sure as hell not going to stand there pretending he belongs." A few of the younger men exchanged uneasy glances. One chuckled under his breath. Another whispered something about the old guy with the museum boots. Laughter followed, quick and uncomfortable, the kind that bounces off concrete before dying in the air. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of gunpowder and burnt oil. A shell casing rolled across the gravel and clicked against the veteran's boot. He looked down at it for a moment, not annoyed, not sentimental, then lifted his gaze back to the range, calm as stone. His eyes were steady, deep-set, the kind that had measured storms before. One recruit, younger than the rest, glanced at the man's posture, the way his fingers stayed locked behind his back like he was still standing at attention. His smirk faded. The instructor noticed. "What are you staring at, Keller? You waiting for him to teach you something?" The recruit straightened, startled. "No, sir." "Good," the instructor barked. "Then keep your eyes downrange." The veteran didn't speak. His silence filled the space the instructor's anger left behind. A gust caught the edge of the range flag and snapped it hard. Every head turned briefly toward the sound. When they looked back, the old man was still there, unmoved, unreadable, utterly composed. And at the far end of the firing line, near the range tower, a figure in uniform had paused mid-step. She lowered her binoculars slowly, expression unreadable. The laughter died out completely. The instructor barked another order, but no one seemed to hear it, because even the wind seemed to carry a question now. Who exactly was this man? And why did it feel like he belonged here more than anyone else? If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The air beyond the firing line had the faint metallic tang of spent brass and dry earth. It clung to the tongue, thick with the aftertaste of noise and smoke. The recruits went back to their drills under the instructor's command, but the rhythm was different now. Each trigger pull seemed quieter. The laughter that had burst so easily moments ago didn't return. Even the echoes off the hills felt subdued, like the land itself was listening. The old man remained where he was, his stance unbroken. For a long moment, he simply watched the line, his gaze following each rifle's rise and fall with a precision that didn't belong to a bystander. His eyes didn't dart, they calculated. Small, steady movements that tracked the wind by how the flag near the target shivered. His hands stayed locked behind his back, but one thumb traced a slow circle over his palm, an old habit from a time when idle hands could get you killed. The instructor, pretending not to notice him now, barked new orders. His voice was sharp again, but it no longer filled the space with confidence. It sounded defensive, brittle. The recruits fired in unison, brass falling like rain, but a few of them, between volleys, glanced toward the fence where the man still stood. In the distance, a pickup truck sat beside the range's perimeter road, paint faded, tires caked in dust. The passenger door hung open, and inside lay a single rifle case, long, scuffed, with the leather handles worn almost white from years of use. On the dashboard, a folded piece of paper fluttered with each gust of wind. From where the man stood, he could see the edge of it pressing against the glass. A printed visitor's pass stamped with the name Raleigh, W., retired personnel. No one on that range recognized the name anymore. For years, Master Gunnery Sergeant William "Brick" Raleigh had been a ghost in the registry, a citation on an old plaque, a rumor passed between instructors who came and went too quickly to know truth from legend. But every spring, during the last week of training before the advanced certification trials, he returned to this field, not to be seen, not to be thanked, just to sit in the wind and listen to the sound of rifles. It was a ritual that belonged to no one else. He had been quiet about his past. Even now, the lines on his face told more than any record could. His left hand bore the faint white ridge of a scar that wrapped across his knuckles and disappeared under the sleeve. The stiffness in his right knee wasn't age alone. It was the echo of something heavier. And yet, there was no bitterness in his eyes, only patience. One of the recruits, Keller, the same one the instructor had snapped at, stole another look between rounds. His scope alignment was off by a degree, and the old man noticed. Raleigh's brow furrowed slightly. He didn't speak, but his head tilted just enough to suggest correction. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Keller blinked, adjusted the stock, and fired again. The shot landed cleaner. He looked downrange, confused for a moment, then back at the old man, who had already turned his gaze elsewhere. From the observation tower, Colonel Nadine Walsh lowered her binoculars and murmured to herself. She had served long enough to recognize posture when she saw it. That stillness built not from pride, but from discipline so ingrained it became instinct. She didn't approach. Not yet. She wanted to see how far the situation would go before she stepped in. The sun began to burn through the clouds, cutting pale light across the training field. Shadows of rifles stretched long across the gravel, each one trembling slightly with the wind. Raleigh took a slow step back toward his truck. His gait was careful, uneven, but deliberate, like someone measuring each inch of ground. Behind him, the instructor shouted again. The recruits fired another synchronized volley. The sound rolled over the range like distant thunder. Raleigh stopped at the edge of the dirt path, turning just slightly to face the line once more. His eyes tracked Keller's grouping. 3 hits, close but imperfect. A faint glimmer of memory flickered across his expression, gone almost as soon as it appeared. He whispered something under his breath that no one heard. Then he turned toward the truck. On the rifle case inside, faintly etched into the corner of the metal clasp, were the worn letters B. Raleigh, Marsoc, 1967-1986. The engraving was shallow, nearly invisible, but to him, it was enough. He reached for the handle, paused, and let his hand rest there. His eyes closed for a moment. The sound of distant shots rolled across the valley, the rhythm of a language he'd never forgotten. Then his lips moved, forming a quiet sentence meant only for himself. Still shooting too fast, he opened the door, took his thermos, and leaned against the truck, waiting, not for an invitation, but for the moment when the arrogance on that field would run headfirst into its own limits. He'd seen it before, many times, and he knew, as sure as the flag still rippled on the wind, that this day was not over. By late morning, the sky had cleared enough to leave a dull blue haze over the hills. The range shimmered faintly with heat rising from the gravel, and every spent casing glinted like a small, forgotten medal under the sun. The drills had resumed, methodical, repetitive, and unremarkable, but tension still hummed beneath the surface. The old man hadn't left. He stood behind the marked spectator boundary, arms folded loosely, eyes fixed on the firing line as if the rest of the world had fallen away. The instructor, seeing him still there, pressed his lips into a thin line and began barking orders louder than necessary. He corrected posture with slaps on the shoulder, shouted at recoil patterns, and lectured about trigger squeeze in the kind of tone that turned learning into humiliation. Each correction came faster, meaner, as though he were performing for the audience he didn't want to admit he had. The recruits followed instructions by the book, too tightly, too nervously. A few muttered to one another between reloads, glancing toward the quiet figure by the fence. One of them said, almost under his breath, "He's still standing there. Doesn't he get tired?" Another smirked. "Old habits die slow." The words carried further than intended. Rawley didn't respond. His eyes moved down the firing line, noting stance, breath, and rhythm. He didn't need to correct anyone. Every mistake was already visible. The jerky exhale before each shot, the finger pressing too hard on the trigger, the premature lift of the cheek from the stock. He could almost hear the miss before it came. Keller, near the middle lane, kept firing in short, tight bursts. His grouping was consistent but wide. The instructor leaned over him, shaking his head. "That's not control, Keller. That's panic. You breathe like you're running a marathon." Keller's jaw tightened. He reloaded, lined up again, and fired. Better. Still not perfect. The instructor smirked. "Maybe you should ask our guest over there for some tips." The line erupted in soft laughter. Keller's ears reddened. He fired again, too hard this time, and missed wide left. Rawley watched it all quietly, expression unchanged. He adjusted his stance slightly, turning his body toward the flag near the range's end. The wind had shifted direction. A faint whistle moved through the valley grass, a warning sound to anyone who knew what wind could do to a bullet's path. The recruits didn't adjust for it. None of them noticed. He muttered, almost to himself, "They're not reading the range." Colonel Walsh watched from her perch on the observation tower. She hadn't announced her presence to the instructor yet, preferring to let the scene play out. She scribbled a note on her clipboard, her brow furrowing. From this distance, she could see Rawley's stillness and the faintest movement of his head as he tracked the shots. Every time a round went wide, his chin dipped in quiet disapproval. Not mockery, but recognition. The instructor walked past again, his boots thudding in the dust. He didn't look toward the fence, but his words found their target. "This isn't the senior center, folks. You want to impress Grandpa out there? Try hitting the black instead of the dirt." A few recruits laughed again, the nervous kind. Not because it was funny, but because silence felt worse. Keller didn't. He fired again, breath held, adjusting slightly for wind without realizing why. His round hit near center. The instructor gave him a perfunctory nod, then turned away, scanning the others. Rawley noticed the correction. His lips twitched. Not a smile, but the ghost of one. Lunch came late. The recruits sat under the shade of a tarp near the ammo shed, eating out of brown paper bags, conversation low and restrained. No one mentioned the veteran, but his presence loomed in the silence between sentences. Keller caught sight of him still standing by the fence, thermos in hand now, staring at the far targets. The old man didn't eat, didn't drink. He just watched, the thermos untouched. "What's he even doing here?" Keller finally asked, not to mock, but to understand. One of the older range techs, gray at the temples, voice rough from years of smoke and dust, shrugged. "You don't know who that is?" Keller frowned. "Should I?" The tech leaned back in his chair. "Used to say his name like a prayer around here. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Rawley. Held the base grouping record for over 3 decades. Some say it was unbreakable." Keller blinked. "That old man?" "That old man," the tech replied, tapping a cigarette out of its pack. "I was here when he said it. Thought it was just luck back then, until he did it again." Keller's gaze drifted back toward the range. Rawley had turned slightly, his shadow long across the gravel. He wasn't looking at the targets anymore. He was watching the recruits themselves. Every detail of their form, like a man cataloging 1,000 little truths no one else could see. The instructor passed again, clipboard under his arm. He followed Keller's line of sight, saw Rawley still standing there, and scowled. He's wasting his time. Whatever record he set belongs in the museum with him. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Rawley heard every word. He didn't react, not outwardly. He simply lowered his gaze to the line of the horizon, the faint shimmer of the heat over the targets, and exhaled through his nose. The breath was steady, almost rehearsed, the same exhale that had steadied a rifle scope long ago. Then, with slow purpose, he began walking toward his truck. Keller watched him go, a flicker of something uneasy passing over his face. The instructor called after him, tone dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, old-timer? Had enough of watching the future leave you behind?" Rawley stopped halfway to the truck. The breeze lifted the edge of his jacket. He didn't turn around, didn't respond. He just reached for the door handle, rested his hand on the metal, and stood there a moment, letting the words settle like dust that never sticks. Then, without a sound, he opened the door and pulled out the rifle case. The sun climbed high and merciless above the range, burning away the last of the morning haze. Heat shimmered off the metal roof of the supply shed, and the smell of oil and dust hung heavy. The recruits lined up again for the afternoon drills, sweat beading under their helmets, eyes narrowed against the glare. The old man had returned to the boundary line, his rifle case now resting at his feet. He had placed it there with care, like an offering. His fingers brushed over the latches once before stepping back, folding his arms again, gaze fixed on the targets in the distance. He wasn't imposing. He wasn't interfering. Just present, a quiet figure under the vast sky. The instructor noticed immediately. He had been waiting for it. His lips curved in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he muttered loud enough for the recruits to hear. "He's back for the show." He raised his voice and addressed the line. "All right, hotshots. Since we've got a spectator today, let's make it worth his while. Maybe if you shoot well enough, Grandpa here will autograph your targets." Laughter scattered along the line. Some genuine, most forced. Keller's shoulders stiffened, his rifle grip tightening, but he didn't speak. The older man's silence seemed to amplify the cruelty instead of diffusing it. Rawley's face remained unchanged. His gaze never left the range, but the faintest pulse moved in his jaw, a muscle twitch betraying the restraint that kept his calm intact. The instructor stepped closer, boots kicking up dust. "You comfortable there, sir?" he asked, voice coated in mock respect. "Need me to get you a rocking chair? Maybe a glass of iced tea?" No reply. Only the steady sound of flags flapping in the wind. The assistant instructor, uneasy, stepped forward and tried to intervene. "Sir, maybe let him sit under the awning for shade. It's pushing 90 out here." The head instructor turned sharply. "He doesn't need shade. He's not staying long." He faced Rawley again, smirk sharpening. "You hear that, old-timer? Rules are clear. Observers stay outside the perimeter. You want to watch? That's fine. But you stay back where you belong." A murmur rippled through the recruits. One of them muttered under his breath, "That's not right." But no one moved. Rawley blinked slowly, as though the insult took longer to reach him than sound could travel. He took a step forward, calm, deliberate, and stopped just short of the firing line. Then, in a tone quiet enough to make everyone lean closer, he said, "You keep the line clean, Sergeant. I'm not here to break it." The instructor's smirk faltered, just slightly. He opened his mouth, closed it, then barked, "Good. Then you can watch what real training looks like." The recruits lifted their rifles on command. The exercise resumed. Brass clattered, dust rose, orders flew. Rawley remained still. His eyes tracked each shot. The tilt of a wrist, the recoil bounce, the impatient breathing. He could see the errors stacking like dominoes. When Keller fired, Rawley's gaze lingered a moment longer. The younger man's stance was strong but stiff, compensating for nerves. Rawley murmured quietly, "Loosen your elbow." It wasn't loud, but Keller heard it. Reflexively, he adjusted. His next shot landed cleaner. The instructor noticed and frowned. He strode toward Keller, irritation sharp in every step. "What was that adjustment? Who told you to change position?" Keller hesitated. "No one, sir. Don't lie to me, recruit," he snapped. Then, turning his glare to the fence, his voice rose to a shout. "If I catch anyone giving unauthorized instruction from behind my line again, I'll have them escorted off base." The recruits froze. All motion stopped. The silence that followed was thick and cutting. Rawley didn't answer, didn't justify. He just looked back at the instructor with eyes that didn't challenge, only observed. The kind of look that came from someone who had already seen men like this burn out long before their tempers did. The instructor's anger sputtered against that calm. "You think you could do better?" he sneered finally. "You think you could outshoot men half your age?" The words hung there, carried by the wind, felt by everyone. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Raleigh lowered his eyes, then glanced toward the range. "I didn't say that," he replied evenly. The instructor stepped closer. "Then prove it." Raleigh looked at him properly for the first time. A slow turn of the head, a measuring stare that stripped away bravado like sandpaper against paint. "I don't have to," he said quietly. "You're already proving enough." The instructor's face darkened. "That's it," he barked. "Pick up your case, old man. You want to stand out here pretending you remember how to shoot? Go ahead. Let's see what you've got." The recruits exchanged uneasy looks. No one laughed this time. Raleigh studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, bent down, and picked up the rifle case. The metal clasps clicked open. Inside lay the weapon. Polished walnut, the finish dulled only by time. He lifted it with reverence, not drama, every motion deliberate. The instructor folded his arms, trying to sound casual. "Be my guest." Raleigh glanced downrange. The wind had picked up again, rippling the flags, dragging the smell of the dry earth across the field. He set the rifle down on the mat, knelt and began to assemble it with the same precision he had shown in silence all morning. The recruits leaned closer. Even the assistant instructor stepped back to watch. The final bolt clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Raleigh adjusted the scope, tested the wind once by holding up a pinch of dust, and whispered to himself. 5 clicks left. He lay prone. The instructor folded his arms. "Go ahead, old-timer. Let's see if the legend still got it." Raleigh didn't look up. He took a breath, long, slow, measured. The kind a man takes when nothing in the world exists except the target and the space between. Then, without a sound, he fired. 1 shot. The flag snapped. The range went silent, and the monitor lit up with a single mark. Dead center. The instructor's smile faltered. Raleigh reloaded and fired again. The second shot landed through the first. He lowered the rifle, eyes calm, and said quietly, "Now, you've got your answer." And for the first time that day, no one laughed. The range fell into a stunned hush that no command could easily fill. The smell of gunpowder lingered thick and heavy, drifting between the lines of stunned recruits. The instructor's voice, which had carried over the wind all morning, seemed suddenly small. He opened his mouth once, then closed it, staring down the line at the 2 perfect holes glowing against the white target 100 yards away. Raleigh didn't smile. He didn't even seem to take satisfaction from it. He stood slowly, one knee stiff, brushing the dust from his sleeve as though he had merely finished a chore. The rifle rested in his hand with a balance so natural it might have been part of him. His movements were slow but sure, every gesture formed by decades of repetition, a ritual more than an act. The recruits watched without words. Some exchanged small glances, disbelief crossing their faces in quiet, unguarded flashes. The assistant instructor moved to check the monitor, squinting at the result, then at the target itself. He spoke softly, almost in reverence. "Both rounds. Same mark." The instructor forced a short laugh, brittle and hollow. "Lucky pull," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Raleigh ignored him. He took a moment to recheck his rifle, twisting the scope gently, then began cleaning it with a cloth from his pocket. His posture remained steady, shoulders straight, breath even. To anyone watching closely, it wasn't pride that kept him upright. It was discipline, ingrained so deeply that even time couldn't erode it. He sat then, lowering himself onto the mat with slow, deliberate care. His boots scuffed the gravel as he folded one knee, and he exhaled with the faintest sound of effort. The recruits expected a speech, a quip, a boast, anything, but none came. Instead, Raleigh laid the rifle across his lap, took out a rag, and began wiping the barrel in patient strokes. Keller, still seated on the ground with his own weapon across his knees, found himself staring. The way the old man worked, every motion exact, every pause intentional, reminded him of the stories his grandfather used to tell about soldiers who never wasted a gesture. The kind of professionalism that couldn't be taught anymore, only remembered. Raleigh adjusted the bolt, checked the chamber, and spoke without looking up. "It's never the shot that matters," he said quietly. "It's what you do before it." No one answered. The words carried through the heat, heavier than sound, sinking into the gravel, into the silence. The instructor turned away, face hard. He shouted for the recruits to resume fire, his voice cracking from strain. The line reformed, but the energy had shifted. The sharpness was gone, replaced by an unease that felt almost reverent. Raleigh rose once more, returning the rifle to its case. As he latched it closed, he caught sight of the faint reflection of himself in the metal, the deep lines, the calm eyes, the steadiness of age. He didn't linger on it. He closed the lid gently, set the case down beside him, and straightened his spine. The assistant instructor, still uncertain, approached him carefully. "Sir," he began, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Raleigh replied softly. "You're not the one who shouted." The younger man swallowed and nodded. Still, that was one hell of a shot. Raleigh's eyes moved toward the horizon, where the hills blurred in the heat shimmer. "I've made better," he said, "and worse." He reached down, lifted his thermos from where it rested by the fence, and unscrewed the cap. The liquid inside had gone lukewarm, but he took a small sip anyway. The sound of gunfire resumed behind him, slower now, more measured. Each crack of a rifle was followed by a pause, as if the recruits were listening for something between shots. Keller fired once more, adjusting his stance carefully. When the bullet landed closer to the mark than before, he exhaled, surprised. Raleigh turned his head slightly and watched. No comment, no nod. Just a faint narrowing of his eyes, enough to mark acknowledgement. At the tower, Colonel Walsh had lowered her binoculars again. She had seen what she needed to see. Not the accuracy of the shot, but the composure that followed it. Her hand lingered on the railing as she watched the instructor pace the line, voice quieter now. She didn't intervene. Not yet. She wanted to see how long arrogance could survive in the presence of endurance. Down below, Raleigh replaced the cap on his thermos and leaned against the fence. The heat pressed against his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze stayed fixed on the range, the targets, the posture of each recruit. Every few minutes, a small muscle in his cheek twitched, the trace of a man silently correcting mistakes in his mind. The instructor's words became background noise. The real training was happening elsewhere, in the space between the shots, in the quiet realization settling into the recruits' faces. They began to fire slower. They began to breathe deeper. They began to think. Raleigh had said almost nothing all day, but the tone of the range had changed. By the time the last shell clattered to the gravel, even the instructor could feel it, though he didn't yet understand what had shifted. He wiped his brow, barked one last order, and dismissed the squad. The recruits dispersed toward the shade, muttering softly. Raleigh stayed. He watched the targets sway in the distance, holes scattered across their paper surfaces. Then he glanced toward the instructor and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the man to hear. "Recoil tells the truth," he said. "Always has." Then he turned and began walking back toward his truck, slow and steady. The case swung gently at his side. No one laughed this time. And from the tower above, Colonel Walsh set her binoculars down and whispered to herself, "Not forgotten, after all." The afternoon light softened into gold, flattening the shadows across the shooting range. The day's drills had ended, but the smell of cordite still clung to the air, mixing with the dry scent of trampled grass and sweat. The recruits sat under the shade structure near the ammo shed, their conversation hushed. They spoke in fragments, about the shot, about the silence after, about the look on the instructor's face. None dared to say aloud what they all felt, that something had shifted. Down by the fence, Raleigh leaned against his truck, arms folded, his gaze tracing the far targets as if measuring distance with memory alone. The heat had eased, but the air still shimmered faintly between him and the range. His rifle case sat open on the truck bed, the barrel now gleaming clean under the lowering sun. The instructor stood several yards away, pretending to review paperwork, though his hands fidgeted restlessly at his sides. Every so often, his eyes darted toward Raleigh, quick, defensive glances that betrayed more uncertainty than he wanted to show. He had built his authority on noise, and noise had failed him. It was then that a low hum rolled over the field, the sound of an approaching vehicle. Dust rose in the distance as a military jeep came to a stop near the tower. The door opened with a solid metallic click, and Colonel Nadine Walsh stepped out. Her boots hit the ground with the calm precision of someone used to being obeyed without ever raising her voice. She wore no expression of impatience, only quiet command. The few recruits who saw her straightened immediately, shoulders snapping into place. Even the instructor's posture stiffened, his earlier bravado vanishing like heat off steel. She walked toward the range with unhurried purpose, the wind tugging at her uniform jacket. Her eyes moved first to the targets, then to the faint marks on the digital monitor still glowing under the shade of the control post. The readouts told their story plainly. 2 perfect shots, dead center, logged under the range's temporary ID system. She spoke without looking up. "Who fired these?" The assistant instructor swallowed, his voice hesitant. "Ma'am, that was the visitor." "Visitor?" she repeated, finally raising her eyes toward him. The head instructor stepped forward quickly, eager to fill the silence. "Civilian, ma'am, retired. He's been hovering around the range all morning. I was just about to have him removed." Walsh turned her head slowly toward him. Her gaze didn't flare. It sharpened. "Removed?" she said softly, as though tasting the word. "Yes, ma'am," the instructor continued, suddenly less confident under her steady stare. "Unauthorized personnel shouldn't—" "Unauthorized?" she interrupted, her tone still calm. "You might want to look again." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded roster sheet. With practiced fingers, she unfolded it until a small column of names was visible. She tapped one with her thumb and turned the page toward him. "Master Gunnery Sergeant William Raleigh," she read aloud. "Retired United States Marine Corps. Record holder, Advanced Marksman Grouping, Camp Aberdeen, Class of '84. That unauthorized civilian was teaching your job before you learned how to lace your boots." The instructor's mouth opened, then closed again. The recruits nearby had gone completely silent. Keller, still cleaning his weapon, looked up and froze mid-motion. Walsh folded the paper neatly and slipped it back into her pocket. Then she turned, looking directly at Raleigh for the first time. He didn't move from where he stood. He simply nodded once, polite, without presumption. "Ma'am." She approached him slowly, her boots crunching lightly over the gravel. "You always pick the hottest day of the year to come back here, don't you?" Raleigh gave the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but recognition. "Seems I've forgotten what shade looks like." She stood beside him, eyes following his toward the range. "I haven't seen a group like that since I was a second lieutenant," she said quietly. He said nothing, but she could tell by the set of his jaw that the compliment was received, even if unacknowledged. After a long moment, she added, "You didn't come here for applause." "Never did," he replied. His voice carried the kind of gravel that only comes from too many years of shouting over wind and gunfire. Behind them, the instructor shifted his weight, uncertain whether to stay or retreat. Walsh didn't look at him. "Sergeant," she said evenly, "you'll prepare the range for a demonstration tomorrow morning." He blinked. "A demonstration, ma'am?" "Yes," she replied. "You've been instructing these recruits for 3 weeks. I'd like them to see how it's supposed to look." The tone was calm, but the meaning was unmistakable. The recruits glanced at one another, small, electric smiles tugging at the corners of their mouths. Keller's eyes widened slightly, as if realizing that the story wasn't finished, only paused. Walsh turned to Raleigh again. "Will you stay?" she asked. Raleigh hesitated, eyes tracing the flag at the end of the range. The wind caught it again, the cloth snapping once against the pole like a salute. Then he nodded. "I'll stay." Walsh returned the nod, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Then tomorrow, they'll see what precision looks like when it remembers where it came from." The sun dipped lower, painting the field in deep amber light. The recruits began clearing their stations quietly, each one moving with new attention, as though the air itself demanded it. Raleigh closed his rifle case and rested a hand on it for a moment. The case was old, the edges dented, the handle worn smooth by years of service. But in that moment, it looked like the most important thing on the field. The instructor stood alone at the end of the line, clipboard limp at his side, pride crumbling under the weight of silence. As the Jeep's engine started again in the distance, Walsh glanced back once, her voice low and steady. "Tomorrow, Sergeant. Don't be late." Then she left the range bathed in the light of its own reckoning. Morning arrived cool and gray, the kind of dawn that seemed to draw its breath before the heat would rise again. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around the posts and sandbags along the firing line. The sound of boots on gravel echoed faintly in the still air as recruits assembled for range prep. The metallic click of magazines, the dry snap of bolts sliding forward, all the familiar noises returned, yet the rhythm was different now. Quieter, more careful. Colonel Walsh's order had spread across the base like rumor and wildfire combined. The message was simple: all personnel to report early for an unscheduled demonstration under her supervision. No one knew what exactly would unfold, but everyone understood that something had shifted. Raleigh's old pickup sat near the boundary fence, dusted with dew. He stood beside it, dressed in the same faded jacket as the day before, but with the small patch of the Marine Corps sewn near the shoulder. His face was calm, expression unreadable as he opened the truck bed and removed his rifle case once more. His movements were unhurried, precise. Every latch, every hinge seemed to open with memory instead of effort. The recruits gathered, some pretending not to watch, others openly studying his hands. Keller, positioned near the front, stood straighter than usual, eyes fixed on every motion. Even the instructor, jaw tight and shoulders rigid, couldn't mask the nervous tension that colored his posture. Colonel Walsh appeared from the tower walkway, her silhouette framed by the pale horizon. She carried no clipboard this time, no air of ceremony. Her presence alone was command enough. When she spoke, her voice carried with clarity that reached every corner of the field. "This range has trained soldiers for decades," she began. "It has seen skill, pride, failure, and courage. But it has not seen this in a very long time." She gestured toward Raleigh, who stood at the line with his rifle case still closed. "This man doesn't need an introduction," she said, "but you deserve to know whose ground you're standing on. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Raleigh, 31 years of service, 2 tours, instructor of instructors. The range you call your classroom once called him its measure." Her words fell into the morning quiet, like pebbles dropped into still water. The recruits shifted on their feet, heads lowering instinctively, not in shame, but in respect. Raleigh said nothing. He simply opened the case, laid out the rifle, and began assembling it once again with slow, deliberate hands. Each metallic click echoed like punctuation in a sentence too important to rush. Walsh turned to the instructor. "You'll run the range," she said evenly. "The procedure doesn't change. He'll shoot on your call." The instructor hesitated, throat working as though swallowing something sharp. "Ma'am, with all due respect—" "Respect," Walsh interrupted softly, "is exactly what we're here to restore." The instructor's jaw flexed. He looked at Raleigh, who met his gaze without malice, only calm patience. The tension between them hung like a drawn wire. Raleigh knelt at the mat. He ran his fingers once along the barrel, checked the chamber, and tested the scope. His motions carried no vanity, only habit, like muscle and memory, agreeing on a rhythm they'd both known too long. He lay prone, cheek against the worn stock, and adjusted his breathing. "Winds light from the east," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Walsh stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. She leaned down just enough to speak near his shoulder. "You ready, Sergeant?" Raleigh's voice was low, steady. "Always, ma'am." The instructor cleared his throat, clipboard trembling slightly in his grip. "Range hot," he called out. "On the shooter's mark." No sound followed. Only wind, the faint ripple of the flag, the creak of leather against the mat as Raleigh adjusted slightly. Then, quietly, he exhaled, a breath that seemed to settle the entire range. The shot cracked through the morning. One, clean, unhurried. The echo rolled off the hills, fading slow. The digital monitor flickered, then displayed a perfect impact. Dead center. No one spoke. Raleigh pulled back the bolt, chambered another round, fired again. Another impact, identical. Then another. Then another. Each shot fell like a measured heartbeat, deliberate, unwavering. By the fifth round, a hush had swept the field so complete that even the birds seemed to have stopped. The final casing clinked softly onto the mat. Raleigh breathed once more, long and slow, then lifted his head. His eyes moved toward the monitor, not in satisfaction, but in assessment. The grouping displayed a single dark blot, 5 shots touching, a single hole widened by perfection. He sat up carefully, knees stiff. His movements were slow, reverent. He unlatched the rifle, cleared the chamber, and laid it across his knees. Walsh broke the silence first. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of authority and truth. "That," she said, "is how legacy looks when it doesn't fade." The recruits didn't cheer. They didn't dare. Instead, one by one, they lowered their heads in acknowledgement. Even Keller, eyes wide and glistening, whispered something under his breath that no one could hear. A small "sir" meant for no one but himself. The instructor stared downrange, face pale. He dropped his clipboard without realizing it, papers scattering at his feet. Walsh turned toward him. "Sergeant," she said, her tone gentler now, "you were right about one thing. He's not part of your class." He blinked, unsure whether she was rebuking or agreeing. She continued, "He's the reason it exists." The instructor swallowed hard. His gaze flickered toward Raleigh, then back to the ground. "Ma'am," he managed. "What now?" Walsh's eyes softened slightly. "Now," she said. "You watch." She turned to Raleigh again. "Sergeant, would you mind showing them a grouping at long range?" Raleigh nodded once, silent. He adjusted his scope, recalibrated by instinct, and settled again into the mat. The distance markers on the board flashed red, 300 yards, then 4, then 6. He fired once more, and the sound stretched across the range like a wave rolling through air. The bullet struck true, center mass, the monitor confirming what no one doubted. Raleigh exhaled again, stood, and placed his rifle back into its case. He looked around the range slowly, at the recruits, the instructor, the flag. His voice came steady and low, roughened by time. "It's not about how fast you shoot," he said. "It's about when you stop missing." Then he closed the case. Walsh nodded, the faintest glint of emotion catching in her eyes. "Lesson complete," she said. And as the recruit stood silent, not in command but in reverence, the wind rose again, cool, clean, carrying the smell of cordite and truth. The flag rippled once, snapping against the pole like a salute from the world itself. And that was the moment the range changed forever. The range was still for a long time after the final shot. The air held the echo of gunfire like a faint pulse that refused to fade. Dust drifted slowly in the light, settling on boots, rifles, and paper targets downrange that no longer seemed like the goal of anything at all. Even the sound of the flag's fabric moving in the breeze had grown quiet, as though the world itself had paused to take a breath. Raleigh stood from the mat, stretching his back until his joints cracked softly. He didn't look toward the recruits or the officers gathered behind him. His eyes stayed fixed on the far horizon, where the sun had begun to rise higher, turning the mist gold. His expression carried no triumph, only quiet endurance, the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of knowing that skill means nothing without control. Colonel Walsh moved first, descending the steps from the tower with a deliberate calm. Each footfall echoed against the wood, measured and even. She stopped near the firing line and turned to face the recruits. They had remained at attention without realizing it, rifles at their sides, their faces caught between awe and disbelief. "Dismissed for 5 minutes," she said softly. "Hydrate, but stay close." No one moved for several seconds. When they finally did, they did so quietly, their steps light, as if they didn't want to disturb something sacred that had just been built in front of them. Raleigh remained by the mat, kneeling to collect the empty shell casings scattered on the gravel. Each one was gathered slowly, almost respectfully, and set into a small pile. The brass gleamed dully in the light. He brushed dust off one with his thumb, studying the faint heat still radiating from its surface. It wasn't the casing he cared about. It was the story it held. Behind him, the instructor watched in silence. His arms hung at his sides, his clipboard forgotten on the ground. He looked smaller now, not in stature, but in presence. His pride had deflated into something quieter, something that looked a lot like reflection. He took a step forward, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, uncertain. "Sir." Raleigh didn't turn immediately. He placed the last casing on the pile before standing. His knees popped softly as he rose. "Yes, Sergeant?" The younger man hesitated, his words tangled. "I misjudged the situation." Raleigh looked at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once. "You're not the first." The answer wasn't sharp. It wasn't forgiving either. It was truth, steady and unornamented. The instructor's shoulders sank slightly, tension leaving his frame. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Raleigh gave a small nod. "I've been teaching for 5 years," the instructor said. "Thought I had this job figured out. Thought being loud meant being strong. But watching you, it's different. You never said a word, and they listened anyway." Raleigh studied him in silence, then glanced toward the recruits, who had stopped pretending not to listen. Their eyes shifted between the two men, trying to learn from every gesture. "You don't teach respect," Raleigh said finally. "You show it. Then they decide whether to follow." The instructor nodded slowly, words failing him. Walsh stood nearby, her arms crossed, listening without interruption. Her expression had softened, but her posture remained formal, protective of the moment unfolding. Raleigh turned back toward the range and picked up his rifle once more, inspecting the barrel with calm precision. He wiped the dust off with a piece of cloth and said quietly, "You remember every face you ever trained, Sergeant. They won't all remember you, but that's not the point." The instructor frowned slightly, confused. "Then what is?" Raleigh's gaze drifted toward the group of recruits sitting under the awning, their faces still half-shadowed by disbelief. "It's whether they stand straighter after you're gone." For a moment, neither man spoke. The words settled in the air like powder smoke, sinking slow and deep. Keller, standing near the far edge of the shade, swallowed hard. He looked down at his own rifle, the weight of it suddenly heavier in his hands. The grip felt different now, no longer a weapon, but a responsibility. He walked forward quietly, not to interrupt, but to understand. He approached the firing line and looked down at the casings Raleigh had gathered into a small stack. One had rolled slightly away, glinting in the sunlight. He bent down, picked it up, and turned it in his palm. The brass was still faintly warm. He didn't hand it back. Instead, he looked at Raleigh and asked softly, "How do you stay that calm?" Raleigh's answer was barely above a whisper. "You don't. You just learn not to let it show." Keller nodded, the words settling in his chest like something carved in stone. He slipped the casing into his pocket, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Walsh caught the movement, her eyes flicking briefly toward Keller before returning to Raleigh. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. "You've done more teaching in 10 minutes than some manage in years." Raleigh gave a small, knowing shrug. "Most lessons stick better when you don't talk through them." Walsh smiled faintly, a rare expression that barely touched her lips. "I'll remember that." The recruits began to reform their line as the colonel ordered, but the energy had changed completely. They no longer looked toward the instructor for validation. They looked toward Raleigh, not as a hero, not as a celebrity, but as the quiet standard they now measured themselves against. Raleigh closed his rifle case, snapping the clasps shut with soft metallic clicks. He looked once more downrange, at the perfectly clean grouping that still showed on the monitor, and exhaled through his nose. The faint ghost of a smile passed across his features. Not pride, but something gentler. The instructor extended his hand awkwardly. "Sir," he said, his voice steadier now, "thank you for reminding me what this place is supposed to be." Raleigh shook his hand firmly, the gesture simple, dignified, without a word of pretense. "You're welcome," he said. "Just don't forget it when the next one stands where I'm standing." And for a moment, just a moment, the old and the young stood together in a silence that said everything words could not. No orders, no titles, just soldiers. And as the wind picked up once more, carrying the sound of the flag overhead, the whole range seemed to breathe with them. They weren't a class anymore. They were a brotherhood. The demonstration had ended hours ago, but no one left the range. The sun hung low, the light softening into that amber hour that made even the dust look sacred. The recruits sat along the benches in a loose half-circle, rifles laid neatly beside them, boots coated in powder and grit. The air was quiet except for the faint rustle of the flag, its rhythm steady as breath. Raleigh sat on the edge of the mat, elbows on his knees, his rifle case open beside him. The gun had been cleaned and stowed away, but he hadn't closed the lid yet. He just sat there, fingers tracing the smooth grain of the wooden stock. His face looked calmer than ever, not proud, not satisfied, just thoughtful, as if the past and present were whispering to each other, and he was the only one who could still hear. Colonel Walsh stood a few paces away, arms folded loosely. She had dismissed the formal order of the gathering. There was no formation, no command tone, only presence. The recruits lingered not because they had to, but because they didn't want to miss what might happen next. Keller, closest to Raleigh, shifted slightly. His curiosity had been building all afternoon, and now it pressed on him with quiet insistence. He leaned forward, careful not to interrupt, but the words slipped out softly. "Sir, can I ask something?" Raleigh turned his head, eyes steady but kind. "Go ahead." Keller hesitated. "Why'd you stop shooting?" The question hung in the air, gentle but heavy. Even the wind seemed to pause. The recruits glanced at one another, unsure if the question had crossed a line. But Raleigh didn't seem offended. He just exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the light met the field in a hazy blur. "I didn't," he said quietly. "I just stopped aiming at things that don't matter." The words were simple, but the silence that followed gave them weight. Keller waited, sensing there was more. Walsh didn't move. She knew better than to speak when truth was deciding whether it wanted to come out. Raleigh leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing against the glow of the fading sun. "There was a time," he began, voice low and rough, "when I thought being the best shot meant being untouchable. When I first held this rifle, I thought skill was the only thing that mattered. You line it up, you pull, you win. That was the whole world to me." He looked down at his hands, scarred and strong even in age. Then one winter, a lifetime ago, that world got real small. We were stationed in a mountain pass, two of us on overwatch, covering a convoy that had to come through before nightfall. Wind was howling so hard it cut your breath in half. Snow thick as fog. We had visibility maybe 20 yards if we were lucky. The recruits leaned in unconsciously. Even the instructor, seated near the tower steps, was listening like a man hearing something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. Raleigh's voice slowed, every word deliberate. We'd been out there nearly 6 hours. No movement, no sound, just wind and waiting. My spotter was a kid, 19 maybe, good eyes, steady hands. He kept me talking to keep us both awake. We were running out of time, running out of light. Then I saw it. Muzzle flash, just for a second. Far ridge. It was instinct. I called it in, waited for confirmation, and he leaned to adjust my scope. His jaw tightened, the lines in his face deepening. That's when the shot came. It hit him, clean through the shoulder, out the back. I can still hear the sound it made when he fell. like breath leaving the world. No one moved. The silence felt alive. Rawley's eyes had gone distant, not lost, but remembering in full color. I dragged him behind the outcrop, but he was bleeding fast. Wind carried his blood off the rock in ribbons. He kept saying he was fine, but he wasn't. He made me promise I'd finish the mission. So, I went back to the scope. He paused, swallowing hard. His next words were barely a whisper. I saw movement again. 3 of them, maybe 4, on the ridge. I lined up the shot. Wind was cutting 30 miles an hour sideways. It didn't matter. I adjusted. I fired. 1 went down. Then another. Then I heard something else. Crying. Soft. Too high to be a man's voice. The recruits froze, eyes wide. Rawley nodded faintly, gaze still locked on the horizon. A woman came running out of the brush. Civilians. They'd been scavenging near the ridge. The boy on the ground wasn't an enemy at all, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He exhaled through his nose, the sound trembling slightly but never breaking. My spotter didn't make it, neither did the boy. After that day, I packed the rifle away. Not because I couldn't shoot, because I didn't trust what it made me anymore. The field was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the grass. No one dared speak. Even the flag sounded softer now, as though listening too. Walsh stepped forward, her voice quiet, but steady. "You saved a convoy that day," she said. "I've read the report." Rawley's eyes turned toward her, calm but sad. "Reports don't show what you miss, ma'am. Only what you hit." Her throat worked as she swallowed. The recruits looked between them, the full weight of the lesson pressing into their chests. Keller's hand drifted to the shell casing still in his pocket. His fingers closed around it, feeling its warmth replaced by the cool of the evening. Rawley closed his rifle case gently, the clasps clicking shut with finality. "You learn the hard way," he said quietly. "Every bullet you fire leaves 2 marks, 1 on the target and 1 on you." No one responded. There was nothing to add. The old Marine stood slowly, brushing dust from his trousers, and looked down the range one last time. The targets blurred in the heat shimmer, indistinct and meaningless now. His voice came low, but certain. "That's why you wait. That's why you breathe. That's why you learn when not to pull the trigger." Walsh nodded once, deeply, as though the truth had reached somewhere words rarely do. Keller looked up at him, voice trembling. "Sir, how do you live with it?" Rawley turned toward him. His eyes softened, their edge dulled not by time, but by understanding. "You don't," he said. "You just live better because of it." The sun dipped behind the ridge, setting the sky ablaze with orange and red. The flag caught the light and glowed like a flame against the dimming sky. And as the first stars appeared above the range, the recruits sat in stillness, young faces carrying the weight of a story they would never forget. That day, they didn't just learn how to shoot, they learned why it mattered. The next morning broke clear and cold. The heat of the previous day had vanished, leaving behind air so crisp it carried every sound with perfect clarity. The base stirred to life early, boots striking pavement, gates clanging open, the distant whine of transport vehicles. Yet around the range, the world seemed different, quieter, as if everyone knew that something important had settled into the ground overnight. Colonel Walsh arrived before sunrise. She stood by the observation tower, clipboard in hand, but her usual air of command carried something softer now. The recruits were already in formation, lined up neatly along the fence line. Their expressions were composed, but their eyes carried the look of men who had been changed by something they could not name. Even the instructor, usually loud and certain, kept his posture modest, his voice lower when calling roll. At the far end of the range, Rawley's pickup sat exactly where it had the day before. He stood beside it, one hand resting lightly on the truck bed, the other holding a steaming cup of coffee. His jacket was zipped against the cold, and the collar framed his weathered face in the pale morning light. He wasn't expecting ceremony. He had seen too many of them in his life, most for the wrong reasons. Walsh stepped forward, her boots crunching softly over frost. She stopped in front of the recruits, her voice calm and clear. "Gentlemen," she began, "we spend a lot of time talking about precision here, about the smallest movements, a breath, a twitch, a decision that separates success from failure. But there's something we forget. Precision doesn't just belong to the rifle. It belongs to character." Her gaze drifted toward Raleigh, who stood a few paces behind the line, not meeting her eyes, just listening. "Yesterday," she continued, "you saw what that looks like when it's lived instead of taught. You saw what it means to hold the line, not for recognition, not for pride, but for the people who will one day stand where you do now." The recruits listened silently, their breath visible in small clouds that hung in the air before fading. Keller's eyes glistened faintly as he shifted his weight, hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't slept much, replaying the old man's words in his head, until dawn broke through the barracks window. Walsh turned to face the instructor. "Sergeant," she said evenly, "you've done good work here, but from this day forward, I'm changing how we begin each cycle of training." The instructor nodded, hesitant but attentive. "Ma'am?" She looked past him toward the range, her voice low but resolute. "Before the first drill, before a single round is fired, every new class will observe a veteran marksman demonstration. They will learn not from talk, but from the presence of those who've already carried the weight they're preparing to bear." The recruits murmured softly among themselves, the sound reverent rather than surprised. Keller's heart kicked once in his chest. He knew what was coming before she even spoke the name. Walsh continued, her tone softening. "Master Gunnery Sergeant William Raleigh will lead that demonstration. When his health allows, his standard will be the measure of this range." The silence that followed was absolute. No one clapped, no one cheered. That would have cheapened it. Instead, every recruit straightened unconsciously, as if the act of standing tall was the only form of applause that fit. Raleigh looked up from where he stood, caught slightly off guard. His brow furrowed faintly, and he opened his mouth as if to object, but Walsh raised a hand gently. "It's not a request, Sergeant. It's a correction long overdue." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, the smallest of movements, but it carried the weight of something immense. "Understood, ma'am." The instructor stepped forward then, his voice quiet but steady. "Permission to address the recruits, ma'am." Walsh inclined her head. He turned to face the young men, his words carrying sincerity that hadn't been there before. "You'll never understand everything this man has seen," he began. "And maybe you don't have to. But if you remember one thing, let it be this. Respect isn't something we hand out. It's something we earn, and yesterday we were reminded how." He looked toward Raleigh and extended his hand. For a moment, the old Marine simply regarded him. Then he crossed the few feet between them and shook it firmly. The two men stood there, framed by the morning light, the sound of the flag snapping faintly above them. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding. Keller stepped forward then, almost involuntarily. He stopped just shy of Raleigh, words caught in his throat. Instead of speaking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the single brass casing he'd kept from the day before. He held it up for a moment, then bent down and placed it on the ground beside Raleigh's boot. Raleigh looked down, eyes softening, and rested his hand briefly on the young man's shoulder. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Walsh watched from a few feet away, her eyes glistening, though her expression remained steady. She gave a small nod and turned toward the flagpole. Her voice carried clearly across the range. "From this day forward, this ground will bear the same creed as the one that made it what it is. Skill, patience, restraint." She paused, then added quietly, "and respect." The recruits, almost instinctively, brought their hands to their sides, heads high. Raleigh exhaled, a faint smile touching his lips. "I've stood on a lot of ranges," he said softly, mostly to himself. "But it's been a long time since one felt alive." Walsh heard him and replied without turning, "That's because it just remembered who built it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of oil and metal, and the first light of full morning stretched across the targets. The field glowed golden, the air ringing with silence too deep to be empty. The day's drills would continue. The rifles would fire again. But from that moment forward, they would echo differently. Every shot would carry the trace of an old man's breath, steady and deliberate. The sound of respect reclaimed. A week later, dawn crept gently across the range. The world was still half asleep, painted in silver-blue light and the faintest mist rising from the fields. The frost had retreated into the shadows, leaving the grass damp and soft beneath the boots of early risers. The air smelled of coffee, gun oil, and something faintly metallic, the scent of a place that had finally remembered its purpose. The recruits moved about quietly, setting up targets and adjusting sight lines. There was no yelling, no barked orders. The atmosphere had changed in a way that couldn't be taught. It had matured. Conversations were fewer, voices lower. The crack of laughter now held warmth instead of arrogance. Even the instructor's commands carried a new cadence, measured instead of loud, patient instead of proud. Near the edge of the range, a folding chair sat beneath the shade of a flagpole. Its aluminum frame glinted faintly in the rising light. It hadn't been placed there by accident. Keller had brought it out himself before the others arrived, unfolding it carefully, making sure the legs sank firm into the gravel. Beside it, on the wooden bench, rested a thermos of hot coffee and a single spent casing, polished now to a soft shine. Moments later, the familiar rumble of an old truck rolled across the dirt road. The sound drew a few heads from the line, but no one spoke. The pickup came to a stop beside the fence, engine idling for a few seconds before going silent. When the door opened, every man on the range straightened instinctively. Raleigh stepped out, slower than before, but with the same steady grace. His jacket hung slightly open, revealing a plain shirt beneath, and his cap was pulled low against the morning chill. His eyes swept over the field. The men, the flag, the targets downrange, and something in his expression softened. It wasn't pride exactly. It was gratitude, disguised as calm. Keller approached first, carrying a clipboard under one arm. "Morning, sir," he said quietly. Not because he was afraid, but because the air didn't need to be disturbed. Raleigh nodded. "Morning." He glanced at the chair, then at Keller. "That you doing?" "Yes, sir," Keller replied, smiling faintly. "We figured you've earned a seat." Raleigh gave a small, approving grunt. "I prefer standing, but I'll take the coffee." He lifted the thermos, unscrewed the cap, and took a small sip. It wasn't great. Range coffee never was. But it was hot, and it was offered with respect. He set it down on the bench, his hand resting beside the casing for a moment. The brass glinted in the light, its reflection catching his eyes. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. Across the field, the instructor raised his voice, not with command, but with acknowledgement. "Eyes front," he called. "We begin every day now with 5 minutes of silence. That time's for remembering what this place means, and who made it matter." The recruits fell quiet instantly. Not a sound, not a shuffle, just stillness. Raleigh stood by the fence, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes on the flag above. It stirred once, catching the morning light, and unfurled slowly in the breeze. The cloth glowed amber for a moment before settling back into motion, rippling softly, never still for long. When the silence ended, rifles were lifted. The day's drills began, crisp, focused, precise. Each shot cracked like punctuation against the dawn, disciplined and deliberate. Raleigh watched without a word, but a faint light touched his eyes each time a bullet found its mark. The line of shooters moved as one now, breathing in rhythm, their bodies steady, their minds patient. They weren't just firing at targets anymore. They were honoring a rhythm that had outlasted decades. After the last volley, Keller lowered his rifle and looked toward the fence. Raleigh met his eyes and raised the thermos slightly in quiet salute. Keller nodded back, a small, wordless smile breaking through the morning cold. The instructor gathered his men, voice steady. "Pack it up. We'll debrief inside." But before they moved, he paused, glanced toward the old Marine, and added, You can leave your rifles clean today, gentlemen. The range was already baptized this week. Soft laughter rippled among them, not mockery, but warmth. Raleigh chuckled once under his breath. He closed the thermos, hooked it by the handle, and turned toward his truck. His steps were slow, sure, deliberate. When he reached the door, he looked back at the range one final time. The recruits had gone still again, watching him. Some raised their hands to their brows in a respectful gesture, uncoordinated, unrehearsed, but sincere. Raleigh's eyes softened. He lifted his own hand slightly in acknowledgement. Not a salute, not quite. Just a quiet gesture of respect returned. Then he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and let it idle for a moment before pulling away. Gravel crunched under the tires, the dust rising behind him like faint smoke. As the sound faded into the distance, the recruits turned back to the range. Keller lingered behind, his eyes catching the small brass casing still sitting by the chair. He didn't move it. Instead, he knelt, brushed away a few specks of dust, and left it gleaming in the sunlight. When he stood again, he noticed something new on the chalkboard inside the observation post. 4 simple words scrawled in thick white chalk, written by an unknown hand. Let him watch, always. It wasn't a command anymore, it was a promise. The flag rippled once more in the wind, its sound soft and eternal. And in that stillness, on that quiet stretch of earth, the old Marine's presence remained, not as memory, but as measure. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.